Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, as well as, of course, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, of course, as well. Significant figures have been assassinated today by the United States in that strike at Baghdad International Airport. Let's immediately get to that, because certainly there are a lot of ramifications of this too, which need to be discussed. Our guests joining us today are Seyed Mohammad Marandi, who is a professor at the University of Tehran. He's joining us now from Tehran itself. Also joining us are Ambassador Asif Durrani, who is a former ambassador to Iran. He's joining us on the line now from Islamabad. And joining us from Suleimania in Iraq is Mohammad Hussein, who is policy director at the Iraqi Center for Policy Analysis and Research, which is an independent research center. Thank you to all three of you for your time today. Professor Marandi, I'll start with you. I just want to get your reaction, of course, from within Iran about what has occurred today and what may happen next.
Well, the Iranians obviously see this as an act of war because it was carried out, this assassination was carried out against an official Iranian figure, a very high-ranking Iranian military figure. Of course, it was also an act of war against Iraq because Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis is an Iraqi war hero who was key to sparing Iraq and saving Iraq from ISIS. These two men were very central figures in the struggle against ISIS, both in Iraq as well as in Syria. The tens of thousands of foreign fighters that Western intelligence services, alongside Saudi Arabia and others, that were brought into the country, they were pushed back by General Soleimani, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, and other figures. So if it wasn't for these two men, we probably would have black flags flying over both Damascus and Baghdad, if not other capitals. And since the United States carried out this crime, they can expect a harsh response from both Iran and Iraq.
And that leads me to my next question. I'm sure you asked this throughout the day because I know you've been giving interviews. Is this the beginning of another war? As you well know, also on Twitter and the rest of the world, that's essentially the trending topic right now.
Well, this is definitely an act of war. The United States is a rogue regime. They carry out attacks against Iraqi soldiers, as we saw over the past few days, with impunity. They have no respect for Iraqi sovereignty. They do not abide by the demands of the Iraqi government. They do whatever they want. They are judge, jury, and executioner, and this is no longer sustainable. Iranians will no longer allow the United States to behave with impunity. They will definitely face the punishment that they deserve. And regimes like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, they will be facing the consequences too. If I was a Western national, I would leave the region as soon as possible.
All right, Ambassador Durrani, I wanted to get your thoughts. You've, of course, been in Iran till quite recently, in fact, as ambassador. I wanted to get your thoughts about this because, as you, of course, appreciate, certainly General Soleimani was an exceedingly important figure within Iran. And, even the polls, independent polls, show that his popularity was far greater than even other figures within the Iranian establishment. What do you think will be the impact of what's occurred?
I think this is a very serious development which has taken place, and there's no doubt this is an act of war by the United States, and it has created a dangerous situation in the entire region, which is already seething under tensions, and so the killing of General Soleimani of a legendary figure in Iran and also in the Middle East region, especially in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. So there's no doubt about it. And this will have a very grave consequences for the entire region. And the United States, by targeting General Soleimani, actually has given a notice to Iran, and I think Iran is likely to respond, whether directly or through its proxies, but it is going to happen. Yes.
Right. So then what do you think this then means for the kind of involvement that the U.S. has had in the region before? Because there's many people talking about the fact that this may actually be signaling the U.S. leaving, especially countries like Iraq. Is that likely to happen, do you think, especially if there would now also be a response from Iran, a harsher response than what's possibly happened in the past?
The problem is whether United States is inside is a bad omen, or when they leave is a bad omen. Whether it was when they were in Vietnam or when they were leaving, or wherever they have gone, they have been a bad news for that country and the region. So this has not been an exception, and they have been there for the past over 50 years, and the tensions are there. So in that way, when you look at it, the United States is definitely a factor of instability in the region. And then there'll be a retaliation from the countries where U.S. troops or their interests are there. Already, I think there are indications and signals that not only United States, but its allies in the region, including Saudi Arabia and UAE, are already being threatened by different groups. So I think the conflagration and the area of conflagration is going to spread, and it's very serious.
Indeed. Mohammad Hussein in Soleimani, I wanted to ask you, give us the Iraqi point of view on this, because it's not just, of course, an Iranian general that was killed in the attack. It's also Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, as I had mentioned, a very significant and important figure in Iraq. How are Iraqis reacting? How should Iraq officially be reacting to this?
Well, most of the Iraqis, top officials, starting from President Barham Saleh, outgoing Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi, basically condemned the airstrike and assassination of General Qasim Soleimani and General Abu Mahdi Muhandis. Of course, they are not happy with it, but they also could not prevent it, and they would probably cannot prevent any further escalation following this airstrike. Simply putting, Iraqi officials and Iraqi leaders and most Iraqi people are not happy with this significant escalation in the U.S. hostility against Iran and one Iraqi territory as well. They are hoping to stand out of this conflict as much as possible. Do not take any part or do not take any side in this conflict. Iraqi leaders believe that both United States and Iran are important allies in its fight against terror organizations like ISIS, and they are both equally important for Iraqi stability, and they are both equally important for Iraqi's trade relations and for both Iraqi politics and economy. They are equally important. So basically, Iraqi leaders just condemned the airstrike, and as they did the same when some anonymous group is attacked a U.S. base in Kirkuk in Iraq. So they don't like this escalation, and they don't want to be part of any regional conflict between Iran and the United States or Iran or any other neighboring countries. We believe that Iraq needs to stay out of this conflict as much as possible, while it is quite difficult.
Indeed, and on that point, Professor Marandi, I wanted to ask you, on this issue of Iraq wanting to not be part of this U.S. versus Iran issue at all, do you think that Iran will respect that in whatever retaliation is to come?
I think that most Iraqis would disagree with your guest, because this attack was carried out against Iraqis as well. A major Iraqi commander was murdered, and Iraqi sovereignty has been thrown into the bin by the United States. And the majority of Iraqis will not accept that.
Thank you, Ambassador Durrani, about that very issue about Iraq, because that's a neighboring country, and Iraq from day one has already asked both the U.S. and Iran to keep it out of their their issues that they have with each other and their differences. Do you believe that the Iranians will respect that, or do you think at this point it's anyone's guess where they will retaliate from?
I think tempers are running high, both from the Iranian side as well as rightly pointed out by the professor, that even Iraqis, because as we all know, the militia group whose commander was Mohammed they were close allies with the Al-Quds force led by General Soleimani. So I expect retaliation, and perhaps give more would increase more tensions, and it may spread. So the situation is really very grave, and every effort should be made to contain the situation. This is the time to have active diplomacy.
Indeed, and then as if I may, just for a moment, as a diplomat who has served your country, I wonder what you think the Pakistani point of view on this should be as well, because certainly Iran is an important neighbor, and if anything were to happen there in any sort of instability, or if Iran were involved in any confrontation with any country, that would affect Pakistan. What should Pakistan's stance be?
View would be that what action the United States has taken, and condemn it, because it's the United States which is responsible for escalating the ladder. So I think we should do that, but at the same time, we should urge restraint by saying that the kind of death and destruction already this region is witnessing. Hundreds and thousands of people have been killed since 2003 when the United States attacked Iraq. Onwards, in Syria situation, almost 6 million Syrians are out of the country. They are refugees. So what kind of influence either party wants to exercise in that region? So they have already, the kind of migration you have seen from Syria is of biblical proportions. What kind of, this realpolitik are we playing? It is only death and destruction.
Mohammed, tell us about what your thoughts are about what Iraq will actually do, because I would imagine it's hard to accept that Iraq will just remain silent, considering it's also, of course, been Iraqis that have been attacked, and that this attack took place on Iraqi soil. So it's one thing to say, okay, we condemn it, but Iraq will need to act in some way too, won't it?
Tomorrow, Iraqi parliament will meet to come up with the Iraq's formal response about the airstrike and the whole conflict. And so far, all the Iraqi officials who condemned the airstrike just called for keeping self-control and rationally approaching the crisis. As I told you, Iraq cannot afford a bad relationship with the United States due to several economic, security, and political reasons. While most of the Iraqi leaders are not happy with this airstrike and not happy with turning Iraqi territories to a battleground between Iran and.
But do you not think, Mohammed, that there will be pressure from the Iraqis themselves, the Iraqi population, that there will need to be responsible? Because this is also about Iraqi sovereignty, certainly.
Absolutely. But take into account the current economic situation of Iraq, the current political turmoil in Baghdad. Leaders do not have enough options. They do not have they cannot afford the antagonizing United States in the time when Iraq definitely needs United States support. And they would try. I would say they would try to help. Diffuse the tension, to help de-escalate the situation. Well, I think it is difficult. But they basically do not help escalating the tension further, and they do not support each side to use Iraqi territories against the others. Most of the Iraqi leaders do not see this conflict is part of our issues, and it is our cause. We are not happy about it, and we don't want it to happen on Iraqi territories. But neither side took Iraqi permission to use Iraqi territories to against the other. So far, the Iraqi officials' response is just like calling for the self-control and condemning the air strike that led to kill General Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi Mohammed.
Ambassador Durrani, I'm going to ask you a very general, but do you actually think war is coming on this issue? I know that, of course, none of us have that answer, concretely either way, but do you think that the Iranians would take it that far from your experience in dealing with them?
Well, I'm afraid the U.S. action is an act of war. There's no doubt about it. There have been instances in the past when the nations have, returned from the brink. So hopefully good sense would prevail. Reason being that already there has been a lot of death and destruction. But that's why I think now is the time for active diplomacy, and especially the P5 and the important regional states. They should sit together and decide about the future course of action. In this regard, I think Iran will also have to, reassess its regional policy. And then all the stakeholders, they have to revisit their mindsets and then try to improve the situation. Because otherwise, already if the act of war has been enacted, then in that case, what is left? The left is, it is only left with, exchange of, more missiles, more, bombings, more direct attacks. So the other option is really disastrous. Yes.
Indeed. Okay. Well, we'll leave there as our final comment on this topic. We appreciate all of our guests, Ambassador Asif Durrani, Mohammad Hussein, who is speaking to us from Suleimania, as well as Professor Mohammad Marandi, who is speaking to us from Tehran earlier as well. Viewers, we've tried to give you all points of view on this issue. I would imagine it's easy to tell the Iranians exercise restraint at this time, but this is, as all of our guests have accepted, really an act of war. So it seems sort of unfair to then expect the Iranians to be the ones to step down and remain calm in the situation when it is their high-ranking general that has been attacked. But nevertheless, looking back at the track record of how Iranians have reacted to other such incidents in the past, you would think that they would also take a fairly calm approach, and a calculated approach is probably the more correct word to use at this time, before they strike back in whatever fashion they choose to strike back with. We'll keep a very close eye on this situation because this will certainly be fluid and develop over the next number of days, especially with the funeral still to take place and that decision of the Supreme National Security Council there in Iran also yet to be revealed. That may not, of course, be revealed publicly. The Iranians will keep that game of the guessing game going. And that very much then gives them the upper hand now in the situation as they choose how to react and how to retaliate specifically at the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, as well as, of course, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. Iraq, of course, needs to decide as well how it will react to that also. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a case about Israeli police officers who were impersonating Palestinian technicians. And this was in a Jewish settlement of Bat Ayin, if I'm saying that correctly. They were then assaulted by two Israeli/Jewish teenagers within that settlement. And that's according to the right-wing Honenu organization. Now, one of the interesting things about this settlement, which I should add on as context, is that the settlers within this specific settlement of Bat Ayin adhere to the principle of Hebrew labor, meaning that their community does not employ Arabs at all. So they're alleging that this was all provocation and that these Israeli officers impersonating Palestinians were thus essentially sent out as bait in some ways to them. Let's discuss that a bit further, because I would imagine that this brings up a lot of issues just to talk about how there are limits, placed on where Arab Arabs and Palestinians can go within the occupied territories. Joining us to discuss all of that a bit further are Ofer Neiman, who is a political analyst, and he's joining us now from Jerusalem. Also joining us from Jerusalem is Jeff Halper, who is the director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. Ofer and Jeff, thank you both for your time. Ofer, let me start with you. What do you make of this sort of a case? It's really interesting to know that there are settlements, not surprising, but to know that there are settlements which would bar any Arabs from working within them. How does that fit in then with the narrative of Israel as a democracy?
Well, this is a combination of far-right religious ideology and perhaps you could say fear. These people, these are really extremist settlers, and a part of their ideology is that the land should be built based on Jewish labor and that no employment should be given to Palestinians. Perhaps there is also a component of fearing Palestinians within their community, but the ideological component is strong. I would like to state, first of all, that yes, I mean, this is extremism, and of course not all Israelis agree with that, but it's ironic that the notion of Hebrew labor, avodah ivrit, was in fact coined many years ago by secular Zionists of the mainstream, like the Labor Party people, when they were encouraging Jewish labor in mandatory Palestine ruled by the British Empire, and in some cases that also involved violence. For example, forcibly removing Palestinian laborers at the time from workplaces.
All right, so Jeff, let me ask you then about what your thoughts are on this, because as I'd put to Ofer there, the understanding that I have now, the context that this provides, is quite disturbing, isn't it? For a state which calls itself the only democracy in the region.
Yeah, but it calls itself a Jewish democracy, not a democracy in the sense of a state that belongs to all its citizens. In fact, Netanyahu came out very angrily against one of the celebrities on TV a few months ago when she asked innocently the question, why shouldn't Israel be a state of all its citizens, which is the definition of a democracy. And he said, no, and I'm shocked that you even asked that question. We have to understand again, and I keep saying this, that Israel is a settler colonial country. For the last 125 years, it has attempted to take over Palestine and as much as possible get rid of the Palestinians, either kill them or certainly expel them. And it's expelled half of them at least. And now it's in the process of imprisoning, like in a Bantustan in South Africa, the rest of them in these little enclaves of areas A and B and Gaza, and even inside Israel into little areas. So that the surprise that somehow you have a normal country that's a democracy that is somehow discriminated against Palestinians shouldn't be a surprise at all. The surprise should actually be if Israel said to the Palestinians, we'll give you citizenship. Since you've been living under our rule for the last 50-some years, let's be a real democracy in the Middle East. But the whole idea that Israel is a democracy, of course, is a sham. It is a democracy if you're Jewish. But if you're Jewish, it's a settler colonial state that has to be decolonized.
Ofer, I wonder if at some level, almost like Frankenstein, and it's something that's gotten out of hand, possibly even for the Israeli establishment. Because if we're looking just at Netanyahu for just a moment, he has these many cases against him. He's obviously now asking for immunity against those cases that are, bribery, et cetera, et cetera. But then he still has a lot of support. So it almost seems like if you have somebody who is right-wing enough, it doesn't matter if he's corrupt, doesn't matter if he's committed all these criminal acts, alleged criminal acts, I'll say that in paragraph, in brackets. But do you think that this is almost something that where it's just the entire society is moving one way and it doesn't matter what anybody really says?
Well, I mean, there has been a dangerous shift towards even more militarism in Israeli society, but I would still know that these specific settlers, they are from a very ideological, extremist part of Israeli society. Overall, you have lots of Palestinians, including Palestinian citizens of Israel, who work in the big cities like Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa. There are much broader issues of discrimination against Palestinians, including Palestinian citizens of Israel. Yeah. This specific policy is more, I would say, unique to the far right wing of the religious settler movement. It is certainly worrying, but not so new if you consider their approach towards Palestinians in the past decades.
As you said there, Ofer, those Palestinians who do even work within Israel, they are discriminated against. So my question then would be, if we allow this sort of settler movement, which is extremist, as you said, to just sit there and allow them to not allow, for example, Arabs to be working there, they're allowed to have their own little bubble, doesn't that then almost give others license to then follow that sort of example?
Yeah, I mean, if you have a far right element like that, you can say that it sort of drags society in its direction. Of course, there's some truth to that. I was sort of trying to point out that our main problems with racism and occupation, and I also use the term apartheid here, run deeper than that. I mean, this is a symptom of something which is deeper. If anything, it is not the far-right religious settlers who are responsible for what we have here in Israel. I would tend to blame the mainstream leadership even more than these settlers. And Jeff mentioned that when he spoke about Israel as a so-called Jewish and democratic state, where Jewish can override democratic.
All right, so Jeff, give me your thoughts on this, because I find it hard to believe that it's just the leadership, right, which is pushing this entire state into a right-wing direction. Would I be fair to say that, would it be right to say, let me put it this way, that the entire society is moving right-wing?
Well, in a sense, I think what happened was with the Oslo, with Barak, I blame Barak, Ehud Barak. This isn't all labor. This isn't all Likud and Sharon and Netanyahu. The Labor Party plays its role as well. And after the Camp David in 1999, Ehud Barak came out and said, there is no partner for peace. I unmasked Arafat. The Palestinians don't want peace. At that moment, virtually all the Israelis, including the left, including the Labor Party and Meretz, the Zionist left, washed their hands of the whole issue. They said, we tried to make a generous offer, which isn't true, but that was Barak's propaganda, that we made a generous offer to the Palestinians. They refused. They started the Intifada. And so we're not responsible anymore. They brought it on themselves, basically. And so Israelis really, I don't think have moved necessarily right wing. Don't forget, Netanyahu has never gotten more than a quarter of the vote. You know, he's not so popular. He's not even that popular in his own party. Just last week, a third of the people who voted for his opposition within the Likud as well. But I think what's true of almost virtually all Israelis, except for the few like me and Ofer, are that they've washed their hands of the Palestinian issue. They say, we don't care anymore. It's up to the army. They can do anything they want to. As long as the Palestinians are under control, and as long as Israelis feel a sense of personal security, there's no more terrorism, there's no more attacks, they can go have their coffee on Friday in the cafes, we don't care anymore. We just don't care. And that's even a worse problem than going right wing, because it makes it completely unpolitical now. It's simply the way it is, and Israelis have washed their hands of it.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave there as a final comment, but of course we appreciate both Jeff and Ofer's time today and for putting this into context for us about this issue of these sort of settlements. Ofer, they're speaking about how this specific settlement is more extremist than others. This Bat Ayin settlement, which adheres to the principle of Hebrew Liber, as he had also described in one of his answers. That's an interesting, certainly, principle. And of course, it just goes to show that if this sort of ideology is allowed to foster even further within Israel, where does this leave its claims of being the only democracy in the Middle East region? Where does it leave its claims of respecting human rights and treating all equally? Are the Arab quote-unquote citizens of Israel, are the Palestinians treated equally? As Ofer said, they're already facing discrimination, even those who do work within Israel, as we understand it. So that's certainly an issue which will keep coming up, and I would imagine that others will take an example from such settlements and only want to create further bubbles where no Arabs are allowed in ever. I'll be back with my final segment after this. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a poll that has come out by YouGov from December 27th, I should say, that 44% of Americans think the U.S. is now in a worse place than it was at the start of 2019. Those results also mirror a CBS News poll from around this time last year, in which 65% of respondents felt the country was on the wrong track as well because of the, quote, state of politics and how the government is functioning. Now, the elephant in the room, especially after today's events that have occurred in Iraq, is, of course, will the U.S. establishment / even Donald Trump seek to almost distract from possibly an impeachment process, distract Americans from the issues on the ground, or will the opinion polls completely change now because of what has occurred now and the possibility, in quotation marks there, of war between Iran and the U.S. as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Allan Dods-Frank, who is an investigative correspondent based in New York. He first investigated Trump in the 80s, and he's formerly been on ABC, CNN, and Bloomberg. He's also former senior editor at Forbes and former president of the Overseas Press Club of America. He's joining us now from New York, as I said. Allan, good morning. What do you make, Allan? Let's start with just this poll, if we may, about why Americans believe that their country is not going in the right direction. What do you think is feeding into that?
It's only one thing. It's all about how you feel about Trump. Trump is the only issue that is controlling what public opinion is all about. And the country is almost split in half based on where it gets news. If you watch Fox News, which is the network that is loyal to Donald Trump, last night, right after the attack on the Iranian general, you wouldn't have even known it had happened because obviously the top management had not yet formulated a storyline for that network. Whereas all the other networks were immediately going to special programming to talk about the implications of the attack. So I think that what's going on is designed, one, to make Trump look like a strong leader, and two, to distract from the impeachment. I mean, the timing was perfect in terms of Donald Trump and more bad news about impeachment as the Senate gets ready and the House stalls about sending the articles of impeachment for a trial.
Before we speak directly about that attack on the Iranian general, I want to actually bring up this fact that it's actually the country's been having a negative opinion for more than a decade about, in fact, its democracy. And that's something that the Pew Research Center has spoken about as well, that the U.S. is almost one of the most unsatisfied countries about the way its democracy functions. And as you well know, Allan, Congress doesn't have very good approval ratings either. Why is that? Why has the country been moving in a direction which Americans don't feel reflects their will?
That's an excellent question, and I'm sad to report that I believe it's a result of a campaign that's been going on now for more than a decade, particularly by the right-wingers, but by extremists on both sides, to try to convince Americans that they should not believe in government. And then the really rich oligarchs, as you might call them in Pakistan, who control some of the oil and gas industries, for instance, do not want regulation. In order to escape regulation, they want to convince people that the government is not worth trusting. The government, of course, is supposed to be protecting everybody, not just the rich. So that the issue has changed over that last decade. At first, it was when the economy had crashed. If you go back to 2009, that was when we had a major recession, almost a depression. And now it is much more about people are being enabled by President Trump's behavior to hate people more in open. It's no longer just impolite to say something nasty about somebody else. That seems to be okay because the tone that's being set in the country from the White House is poisonous. Now, if the stock market weren't doing so well, these poll numbers would be astronomical. But I think it's a shift from how people felt about the economy to personal relationships.
Indeed. Right. Now, let's talk now about that attack in Iraq, the Baghdad airport, which has not only killed, of course, an Iranian general, but also an Iraqi military commander of a high rank also, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. Do you think that, and I hate to use this argument, but a lot of people have brought this up, that this is actually possibly Donald Trump looking for a distraction away from impeachment?
He might well succeed with this. A lot will depend on how the Iranians react, because it's not in dispute that the Iranian general who was killed is, from an American point of view, a really bad man, a guy who has been planning attacks and executed attacks on American forces and civilians for a long, long time now in more than just one place. So nobody's going to miss him. And I think everybody in politics in the United States will to some degree say, well, good riddance to this guy. However, the manner in which it was done and the reactions from Iran will determine what's next, in the sense that the public will be waiting to see. I'm looking to see what Donald Trump says tonight in Florida when he's talking to a Christian evangelical group at one of his big rallies. Now, if he stands there and brags about how he killed this guy and nobody can touch him, and he sounds like a mafia leader or a third world dictator, I think that's going to be really bad, because he's standing there in what is seemingly a religious setting, bragging about killing somebody of another faith. Yeah. If he keeps it toned down, which would be uncharacteristic, it might produce a different reaction, especially among the people who are generally not in favor of Donald Trump.
Allan, correct me if I'm wrong, but obviously no U.S. president can just carry out such an act of war without actually prior approval from the correct bodies, such as Congress and others. So that's the argument that's been used against him. What does that then mean for democracy, American democracy?
Well, I guess that you're getting right at my point, which I maybe should have made it sharper.
Yeah. The
issue is whether Trump is behaving like a U.S. president or a dictator. And I think we have to watch what happens in the next couple of weeks. Certainly, the Democrats, if it turns out that he did not notify the so-called Gang of Eight, which are the leaders of the Senate and the House and the Senate and House Intelligence Committees, that this was going to happen, there are going to be questions. I mean, during the Vietnam War, there was a famous resolution called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, in which only 2 senators had voted against authorizing war against Vietnam. That was one of the reasons the United States ended up being in it for so long, because the presidents who were in charge during that decade felt empowered. Trump doesn't necessarily already have that congressional approval. And there is a branch of the Republican Party, or at least there used to be, that did not believe in unlimited power on behalf of the president. These are the same people who wanted to limit the power of government across the board. And we will see how they react to what Trump did.
And if I may get a final comment then from you, Allan, before I let you go, do you think that this is, in a line of bad military decisions on the part of U.S. leaders? We can go back to the Iraq invasion as well, which may have sparked all of this to begin with, and that's why we are where we are today right now with the tensions in this region. Why are there such bad decisions being made when it comes to military interventions, et cetera?
I guess bad decisions are made when you have bad intelligence. I mean, in this case, at least in terms of the location of an Iranian general in Iraq, the intelligence was pretty good. So I'm not sure how to answer that. Bad decisions are made when you don't have more than just a moment when you take a decisive action. You have to have a strategy, a plan, something that's thought out, that's coherent. And it's not at all clear that the Trump administration has a coherent Middle East policy. I mean, I don't know what will happen if the Iranians decide the way to answer this first is to attack the Saudi refineries. That could be a real problem, and obviously they're vulnerable. Because at some point, the United States won't just send American troops on the ground to defend Saudi oil. We'll see how all that plays out, or whether there's an attack somewhere else. But the idea that an Iranian general is just running around Iraq, its one-time enemy, and commanding large portions of these independent militias is a little scary.
All right, well, we'll leave there as a final comment. But Allan, as always, we appreciate your time this morning and for, of course, your insight. This issue, of course, of how polls work in the United States is an interesting one because it changes, right, when it comes to a situation of war. We saw this happen with George W. Bush as well, George Jr., that is, especially after 9/11, his support going up significantly after those attacks and after he launched the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. Also, is that what Donald Trump is trying to do, especially trying to distract from his impeachment process at this time as it will begin in the Senate, those hearings and trial? Or is this simply just the United States hitting out at an enemy? You would imagine that, especially at Baghdad International Airport, that the U.S. would have had the intelligence about his comings and goings anyhow. So why choose now? What exactly is the game plan right at this point in time? A lot of questions left unanswered, but as I said in my first segment as well, this is a fluid situation which we'll be following here in Scope very closely. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.